JJ, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. And I wonder if you could just start off by giving us a little introduction to who you are.
Yeah, sure. My name is JJ. Flag is the last name. That's 1G. I'm originally from the lovely city of Miami, in the great state of Florida. Uh, Unfortunately, we end up being the butt of a lot of jokes, being from the state of Florida. But I'm here to redeem us today, uh, and I have the awesome privilege of pastoring Emmanuel Congregational United Church of Christ here in the lovely city of Watertown, New York. Our claim to fame is that we are about 30 miles away from the Canadian border.
Oh, wow.
So if you would have told me years ago that a kid from Miami would be pastoring in the North Country, I would have said something's wrong. But yet, here's where I am. A little bit about me, I would say, outside of pastoring, I'm really passionate about issues pertaining to disability and accessibility in the church. Since it is not as obvious to you all who may be watching or listening to me, I am someone who navigates life using a wheelchair, having been born with cerebral palsy. And so disability and the intersections of disability and theology are things that are very important to me as a pastor. And so that's a little bit about me. Hopefully we'll get into some reasons why as we have this conversation, which I'm really grateful for the opportunity. So thank you very much, Lance.
Yes, thank you. Well, so yeah, why don't we start with looking at what was your childhood experience of faith like? What was church like for you? Who was God to you?
Sure. For me, I would say, and I feel like I tell this story everywhere I go. I actually got to know the sounds of church before I ever got to know what the inside of a church was like. So my family lived a ways. We actually lived across the street from a church, and this was during a time where, in the city, churches still had their doors open during service, and so I could hear the choir singing, the people clapping and shouting during service, and the preacher, who was very boisterous and demonstrative. At least it sounded like they were very demonstrative. And so that kind of spurred this curiosity in me to know what was going on inside of the walls. And so I begged my parents to let me go to church. And eventually they gave in and let me go. And something about the experience gripped me such that I never wanted to leave. And so it was the sounds of church that drew me to church, and it was the sounds that kept me. And as I grew in community, I think my understanding of God kind of took shape. And so I first got to know God as, I would say, as someone who was loving and kind and very interested in me as a person. And that view kind of changed over the years because I went through a phase where I was afraid of God and afraid of what God wanted from me and expected of me. And that came as, as theologies changed and my exposure to different understandings of God happened. I think namely, hearing, I mentioned at the beginning of this that, I was born with a disability, hearing for me that part of the reason why I was disabled was because I didn't have enough faith, or that God was holding me responsible for some sin, either hidden sin in my life or sin in my own family's life. That really changed the way that I looked at God. God was no longer, to me, this loving being who was interested in the best me, but really this vengeful narcissistic, petty. God, that God would hold me responsible for something that I had no power over. Just seemed very petty to me. I think is the best way that I could describe it. And so I made this decision at some point in my journey that I wanted nothing to do with God. I said, God, if this is the kind of God that you're going to be, and this is the kind of God that you are, I don't want anything to do with you. And then there were some changes along the way, as is obvious because I'm pastoring. But me and God went through a phase where we weren't on the best of terms with one another, or I should say I wasn't on the best of terms. God wasn't on the best of terms with me. I don't know if it changed God's relationship to me, because I think God's love is steadfast and consistent, whether we understand that or not. I would say that my wanting to be in relationship with God was definitely in a different place after being exposed to different lines of thought. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's such a huge journey, right? To have this sort of innocent connection with God where you believe God wants your best. And then suddenly God is this vengeful, petty person, right? Like it's your fault that you are experiencing what you're experiencing. You did something wrong or someone else did something wrong, and you have to bear the consequence. I wonder, how did you resolve that?
So very, very, very ironically, it was an encounter with the Bible that resolved this kind of God, I want nothing to do with you moment. And I would say what felt like it was a brief period of time, but for me it was significant enough that it made me look at God differently. But specifically, what was the turning point? I remember after having several encounters with people who made me question my relationship to God and my own my own standing as a believer, and a believer who has a disability, right? The turning point for me came when I had gone to the doctor, and I was having a talk with the doctor about wanting to be able to stand up and walk again with the assistance of some devices by the time I was 21. I think at the time I was 18 maybe. Went to the doctor. The doctor pretty much, long story short, like dashed all of my hopes and basically said, that's not going to happen. You can give up on it, right? And so I came home and I grabbed my Bible, and growing up in the church that I grew up in, the Bible was synonymous with who God is. And so in this act of saying, God, I want nothing to do with you, I prepared to throw the Bible to the other side of the room. And as God would have it, the Bible opened to John chapter 9. And I started to read John chapter 9. And for anybody who's listening and you're familiar with John chapter 9, this particular passage of scripture, even if you're not, it's about Jesus and his disciples journeying along the side of the road, and they encounter this man who was blind from birth. And the disciples begin to ask the question, who sinned that this man was born blind? Who was responsible for him being born blind? Was it him or was it his parents? And Jesus looks at them and says, you're focused on the wrong thing. Neither of these are the case. It wasn't him or his parents. He was born this way so that the glory of God might be revealed in him. And for the first time, I saw myself in the text. I read that and I was like, wow, that's me. God wants to do something in and through me. At least that was how I originally interpreted the text, right? Like, God made me disabled because God wanted to do something through me. And I think as I've grown in my understanding of God and understanding of that particular text, that's actually not what the text means at all. It simply means that here's this man with a different experience that is showing the diversity of how God shows up in the world.
Mm.
So it's not that God created him so that God might be glorified in his disability, but it is to say that God's glory is not confined to one particular way of being. And so in that, I would say that my understanding of God and my relationship to God completely changed and has continued to change as I have grown in being able to see God expressed through many people in many different ways, in many different embodiments. And so that, I mean, that really is the core of my ministry work, is to help people lean into the way that God might be glorified in them being their most authentic self.
Yeah, that's such an important shift in the way you view that
Oh,
text,
most
right?
definitely.
Yeah. Even though the first one still, like the first reading that you had of the text still helped you
Yeah,
and helped you embrace yourself, right?
yeah,
And helped you repair relationship with God, find a way for God to be, for you to feel like God was okay with you.
yeah,
But I can hear, I mean, the difference that I hear in one is like, you're still not perfect. So God is going to show up in a special way, right? So somehow filling in the gap or something.
yeah,
And then in the second reading is like, no, we're all different. We all have different bodies,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
We're all on this spectrum of able-bodiedness versus not being
yeah,
able-bodied, right? And it's not an either or binary in the strict
yeah,
sense always, right?
yeah.
It's more, I mean, my understanding is thinking of it more as spectrum, right? And being able to recognize that differences along the spectrum.
Yeah, and I think that's what's beautiful about the second understanding, or the second reading of the text. It blows up this binary idea,
Right. Right.
and I think that's one thing that I'm the most grateful for, um, because we tend to think about God as an either or, black or white, just very straight line on this side of the fence or the other, and this particular text takes all of that and just throws it in the air. It's like none of
Mhm.
that. you know,
Yeah.
um, I love to tell people my favorite translation of that particular text comes from the Message Bible, and I
Mm.
know that seminarians and people who are academics will hear this and say, "Oh my gosh, I cannot believe that he said that." Um, but Eugene Peterson's paraphrase of this verse is so beautiful to me because uh, um, the verse goes something like this. The disciples asked the question, "Who sinned that this man was born blind?" And Eugene Peterson says that Jesus's response is, "Look instead for what God can do." That our perspective is so tied to what can't this person do. Uh, and Eugene Peterson says that the whole reason why this happened is so that the disciples learn to look instead for what God can do. And so that's the way that I had to start looking at my own life as a person with a disability, and then my interaction with other people with disabilities. How do we push people to look instead for what God can do and not be bound by what they see as a limitation? And so to that point, I have to give major props to my congregation for looking instead for what God can do. When they encountered a man who is black and in a wheelchair, something that they had never encountered as a pastor, and being willing to say, "Yes, we see something in you that is worth taking a chance on, and leaning into the God in you." and leaning into the God in you and your ability to lead us to follow the Spirit and God at work in whatever way that fleshes out. So I mean, that reading of the text is something that I try to give people room to interpret the Bible in a way that is life giving to them. But I really want people to buy into that we
Right.
that we really start to see um, uh, God's glory being understood as diversity in creation.
Mm.
So whether that's people who are black, brown, white, anywhere on the spectrum, and I mean when I'm talking about spectrum, I mean people who are LGBTQ plus, people who are non-neurotypical, and people who are typical. Like there are so many spectrums at work in the world, and I think if we can learn to see God in every one of those spectrums, we would do ourselves well, uh, not only in opening the church's doors to everyone, but being able to experience God's glory within our own faith communities. So
Mm.
I will step off my soapbox now.
No, I love that. Like there's just something so powerful about moving away from this mindset of like this is what perfection looks like, or this is what things are supposed to be,
Yeah,
right? And saying, well, actually, if we can let go of that idea and just recognize that within everything and everyone
yeah,
is a
yeah.
picture of glory. And it's for us to capture that picture. Like that is
I'm
our
gonna
work.
take that whole phrasing and preach it just like that. That is good. I
Yeah.
like it.
I mean, I just find that such a more helpful framing. And I think also your reframing of like, no, it's about asking what people can do, right? We focus so much on what people can't do, especially when it comes to disability, right?
Yeah,
But being able to say like, well, no, these are still like full human beings who have thoughts, they have experiences, emotions, right? They're still,
yeah.
right, divinity that is held within there for us to unleash.
I think if you and to that point, if you go back to John 9, right? Jesus in this encounter with the disciples, I think what is so interesting is Jesus doesn't rebuke them for asking a question.
Mm.
He never
Mm-hmm.
says you shouldn't ask a question. He just points out they're asking the wrong question.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And so, like, this work of being a disciple, a part of the work of being a disciple is to ask questions. So I think this ultimately comes down to like, what are we doing in churches to open up spaces so that people can ask the tough questions?
Right.
Even when it comes to disability, like,
Mm-hmm.
what have we taught that makes people think about people with disabilities a certain way? How do we need to reframe that teaching so that people who leave our spaces see people with disabilities as full people? And I shouldn't even say see, because that is even a narrow way of like framing this. But how do we frame things so that people who leave our spaces encounter people with disabilities as full human beings, not needing to be saved or healed or anything,
Right.
but as worthy contributors to like the way that we understand and encounter the rest of the world. I that in that text is so much more than like what is on the surface. I think it's a masterclass. At least this is the way that I've told people over and over again about this text. I think it's a masterclass on what it means to be inclusive of all
Mm.
people, because Jesus never once makes the disciples feel like crap because of their curiosity, but he
Mm.
reframes their curiosity and says,
Right.
if you're curious, let me help you turn that curiosity into something that is going to make a difference. So,
Yeah. That's so good. So I wonder, so you've come to this point in your life, you're like 18 years old, you're reading the Bible, you have a new interpretation. How do you move from that space to becoming pastor?
Woo! That was a hell of a journey. I'll tell you that much. There were a lot of bumps and bruises. Not literally, maybe maybe not literally, but there were a lot of emotional and spiritual bumps and bruises along the way. I can remember being a part of several ministries where I was like the token guy, the token Black guy, the token guy with the disability, and being so like discouraged by my experience and not really wanting to continue being this token guy over and over and over again. And finally making it to a point where I had committed to working in the church, but not vocationally pursuing ministry as a pastor. And then God does what God does. I found myself in a prayer meeting in the Panhandle of Florida, in the back of a Methodist church. And there was this pastor there who didn't know me and I didn't know them. And the pastor said, "It's time for you to stop running from God." And I said, "I don't know what you're talking about. Leave me alone." I knew exactly what they were talking about, but I didn't want to hear it at the moment. And I wrestled with God over and over and over again about pursuing this call to ministry. And eventually gave in and joined the Methodist Church and started to pursue ordained ministry in the Methodist Church. And then had another crisis of faith, I guess you could say. And I really started to wrestle with the notion that in the Methodist Church, there was this, or there is this mantra that, we have open hearts, open minds, open doors. That is, unless you are LGBTQ+. And I really did not like that reality. And so just before becoming a provisional elder in the United Methodist Church, decided to drop out of the ordination process and started the process completely over in the United Church of Christ. And a few years later became ordained as a minister in the United Church of Christ. And so now I'm pastoring in the United Church of Christ and serve on the Disability Ministries board of directors and do a bunch of other things within our local association. I'm on the committee on ministry and a bunch of other stuff. But yeah, I went from being, God, I want nothing to do with this, to now using this space and opportunity as a way to say, there were folks who were a part of my journey who didn't mind opening the door for me, and who, in a sense, made ramps and elevators where there were no ramps and elevators for me to get to certain places. And so now I feel like it is a part of my call to do that same work. And so it is no surprise to me when I look back on my journey that I went from seeing this glaring gap of inclusion of people with disabilities in the church, and then wrestling with the inclusion of LGBTQ folks, because justice work is always intersectional work. And so whether it is opening the door for people with disabilities, or opening the door for LGBTQIA+ people to be welcomed into the work of ministry and the life of the church, I think all of those things are intersectional. And so if I can jump back on my soapbox, I would say those people who are committed to the work of justice have to understand that you cannot get away from the intersections of those two marginalized groups. And I even wrestle to say those two marginalized groups because there's so much overlap between the two. So to separate them seems a bit disingenuous or not truthful. So yeah, but that's why I am. That's why I am where I am. is really understanding that sense of call to the work of justice and inclusion on both sides. So,
Yeah, I wonder, in that journey, where have you felt like people really, really got it and made space for you to belong as you are, rather than felt like you had to be something that they wanted you to be or whatever?
I don't know that I've been in any place yet that fully like has allowed me to be me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I would say that being a minister in the United Church of Christ, just in general, has been much more freeing than any other space that I've been in, because it has being a UCC minister has allowed me the freedom to wrestle with my theology.
Mm-hmm.
I think in other spaces I've been in, and this is no like jab against any other denomination, um, but so many of the other spaces that I've been in, whether it be in my work or as a parishioner or a congregant, um, there was always this expectation that I'd have things figured out. Um, and yet in the UCC, there seems to be this leaning into wrestling, and being able to be honest and say, I don't really know. And I thought I knew yesterday, but I don't know today. And what I knew yesterday, I no longer know, because I think about it differently today. This notion that God is still speaking, to me, creates so much freedom, because it pushes me to listen. If God is still speaking, then that means I've got to listen.
Yep.
So that I know what God is saying. And so I think in that sense, being a part of the UCC has allowed me to be my most authentic self, because it has allowed me to wrestle the most, and wrestle openly and freely, without fear that I'm going to be perceived a certain way. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's huge. I can attest to the same thing as a fellow UCCer. I feel very free. I make jokes with people about this all the time, that I can kind of say what I need to say and figure it out along the way, like there is much more expansiveness, I
Yeah,
feel.
yeah,
Yeah. So in that expansiveness, you talk about being open to asking new theological questions or discerning new things. Are you comfortable with sharing any of those things that you've
Ooh.
discerned through?
Let's see. I'm wondering. Okay, so one of the this may get me in trouble with some people, but that's okay. I recently Trinity Sunday was a few weeks ago, and I've never done a sermon like this before. But I started the sermon by saying, the Trinity, what the heck is it? Like, truth be told, I don't think any of us know how to articulate it well, without committing heresy. Um, and some would say it is the most complicated Christian doctrine, to the point that we need to throw it out, right? Being a part of the UCC gave me the freedom to own that even after a decade plus of theological education, I still don't know how to articulate the Trinity well enough to be comfortable with what I'm saying, right? But that doesn't mean that we should throw it out. Because if we look at the Trinity, it teaches us something about how the church should be in community with one another. So if we look at the Eastern Orthodox way of understanding the Trinity, there's this divine choreography that happens where every person who's in the Trinity is interdependent on the other in order for the choreography to work. And if we take that same understanding and impose it on the church, there's this interdependence that has to happen in order for the church to be successful in the work that we are called to as an instrument of justice and peace. And justice, peace, and joy in the world.
Mhm.
We often talk about this justice and peace, but we never talk about the fact that we should be joyful in the work that we're doing, right? We walk out with stiff faces like we're smelling something stinky, and we never have any joy in what we're doing. But this whole picture of like divine choreography says that there's something about that should be doing something in the community life. And so I think if there's anything that I've been discerning and wrestling with and trying to flesh out most is, how do I take that understanding of the Trinity and make it work in my current context, and even in my like expanded theological perspective? So that probably got me in trouble with a few seminary professors and another few academics, but hopefully you can pick up the spirit of what I'm saying.
I'm in the same place with you. I mean, I started Trinity Sunday with like, what does this even mean? Why do we talk about this? Is it worth holding on to? You know, and then asking, is it even just the early church trying to elevate the status of Jesus to divinity, but not be considered polytheistic?
Now, see, that's a whole nother conversation, because we can do a whole nother podcast on my wrestling around that question alone.
Right.
But
yeah. But then, I mean, I land in that place of relationship, right? It's a
Yeah.
model. And I talked about the multiplicity of the self in psychology, right? That even our internal selves is not one, it's not singular. We have multiple selves that are in conversation with each other.
I mean, that is the beauty of this conversation, right?
Right.
What we're talking about, at least in the way that I understand it, is this evolution of selves that has happened over the course of my own journey with God.
Right.
Where I understood and saw myself this way, and then, had this other encounter. It's kind of like the shack. You have all of these encounters with these multiple expressions of who God is. And in each encounter, you get to know yourself a little more. And in so doing, you also get to know God a little more. So I probably committed major heresy there too, but it's okay.
I mean, I'm right there with you, so. Heretics, whatever, we are who we are. Heresy is an invention of the institution to silence people on the margins. So, that's my theory on heresy.
That's a good one. I like it though. You should put that on a poster so I can put it behind me.
Yes. I mean, for me, right, like this is something that I do appreciate about the UCC, right, is that there's this open space where we can ask questions. I remember in my ordination paper, the things that I wrote, I probably would not have been able to write in another space. I would have gotten in trouble for some of the things I said. But
like me throwing out because there are a lot of our Christian siblings still hold on to the idea of original sin.
Right.
The UCC gave me the space to throw that away and say, I do believe that sin is an individual thing, but I think we need to look at it more systemically.
Yes, 100%.
And stop narrowing it down to people and particular behaviors, and start looking at what systems have been put in place to allow people to sin perpetually against others. I would have never felt the freedom to write that in another space. So yeah, I definitely agree.
Right. Yeah. So how do you feel that this sort of space to question, this space to be more expansive, impacts your ministry now?
I think it's only helped my ability to be vulnerable as the minister. I can say growing up, vulnerability was not something that I witnessed from people in ministry.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there was almost this unspoken expectation that they would always be on and always have the right answers, and never be able to slip up. And this questioning has allowed me to come to the table in some of my toughest moments and say, I really don't have an answer for you. Because as much as you are wrestling in this moment, I am wrestling with you. And
Mm-hmm.
uh, and as much as you are unclear in this moment, I am unclear. And we can be in this space together. And so as a minister, this openness has given me the freedom to practice the ministry of presence rather than the ministry of poignance. I think so many of us are so committed to being poignant and clever in certain moments when we just need to learn to be present. And
Right.
so this wrestling has really allowed me the space to say, I don't know. I can't give you an answer, but I can offer you my presence, um, and and hope that my presence makes a difference. And if we need to journey toward an answer together, we can do that. But yeah, I feel so liberated as a minister. It's very refreshing.
Yeah, I mean, that's so powerful because I think, again, when it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, this notion of, what we're supposed to be, or what is like the perfect pastor or the perfect person, even, right? This notion, and this is about our embodiment too, right? Like, ministry as presence requires attunement to what's happening within my
Yes,
own body.
yes,
And if I'm so focused on what perfection is, I'm not attuned to what's happening within me,
very true.
because I then lose touch with the things that I may be uncomfortable with, or the things that I'm ignoring, right? Like, growing up, I coming from like the deep South and the Southern culture with like, there were no such thing as like negative feelings. Like, anger was bad,
You have
right?
the toxic positivity.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
right. And so this sense of like, for me, attuning to when I feel angry, attuning to my body in those moments is so hard. Like, it's still very much a work in progress for me. But being even able to attune to the fact that it's a work in progress is a step for me.
yeah. I mean, that's
Yeah.
major. That's major for
Yeah.
so many people. I can remember the first time I sat with a parishioner and a patient, and 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 was able to say to them like, God is big enough to handle your anger.
Right.
Um,
Right.
I can remember having that moment of awakening with God in seminary for myself. Uh, I remember I was in a class with Dr. Black at
Mm-hmm.
Princeton Seminary, and I will never forget this. We were doing prayers in the New Testament, and for some reason, in the midst of this class, he took a detour and went into the Psalms, and I at the start of class was like, I'm over this. I want to flip tables and I want to curse people out because I was
Mm.
angry. I was angry that at the time so many black men had been killed by police, and they weren't facing any kind of like just accountability. No justice was being served, and I think that we had just gotten word that another black young man had been killed by the police, and and I was angry. And I remember talking with Dr. Black, and it happened after class. He said something about, God already knows what's going on with you, so why don't you just tell God what's on your heart and on your mind? And being the good Baptist kid that I am, I was like, I can't say the things to God that, that are on my heart and mind. And Dr. Black said, well, God already knows it. Why do you think the Psalms are there? Like, a lot of these Psalms existed because people were having it out with God and the position that they were in. And so I was like, no, I'm not okay with that. But then I went home, and I think it ended up being, I think it was Psalms 34, if I'm not mistaken. It might have been Psalm 24. And I can't believe I'm drawing a blank on which one it was, because I read it like every day for maybe a month just to help me get out of a funk. But David is talking about being in a cave. And he's like, God, I don't think you see me. I'm going through all of this, and where are you at when I'm going through all of this? And so I read that every day for myself, and once again found myself in the text. But there was that being attuned to my own feelings that allowed me to be honest with God and use some words that were not, not the most. There were 4-letter words, and the 4-letter word was not love. And Dr. Black gave me the freedom to do that, because he said, God is big enough to handle your anger and your displeasure and your confusion with life. And experiencing that moment for myself allowed me the freedom to tell patients and parishioners, God is big enough to handle your anger. And so I've opened up my office sometimes for parishioners to come yell at God, and have sat in the room with patients and journeyed with them as they yelled at God about, not feeling the best about the cards that they have been dealt, but letting them know that God is big enough to love you and to also hold your anger. And being able to do that comes from being attuned with my own stuff, and not like, oh, I'm afraid to do it, so you must be afraid to do it too. But giving them the freedom to do it, because I've experienced that freedom for myself. So.
Right. I mean, I think that's such a powerful example of how, like, especially within helping professions, right? We become the tools that we use to help others, right? It's like our own processing of our own mess, our own, as you said, like confusion, our anger, our fears, right? If we can learn to hold those things for ourselves, we're developing the skills to offer that to others, to make space for that. And that's such a different kind of, it's such a different kind of world, right? Than I think, certainly than I grew up in, where
I would definitely agree.
Yeah.
I know that a lot of the ministers that I grew up around, they all had a different voice. When church started, their voice turned into something different. They they carried themselves differently, and I think that's part of the reason why I wrestled with being called to ministry for so long, was because I didn't know how to be that kind of a minister. And then God is like, yeah, but that's not what I called you to be anyway. So be you. And I think, as I'm thinking about like my own denominational affiliation, the beauty of being UCC was this stamp of approval on who I am as an individual. It was the affirming of my me-ness, if that makes sense. Like I didn't have to embody someone else in order to make it work. So I feel very at peace.
Yeah, I love that. The embodiment of my me-ness. Yes. Yeah. So I'm aware of time, and I want to transition us a little. And I want to ask, what do you see in terms of the future of Christianity and or the church?
Oh, Lord, you asked the most difficult question at the end? Oh, wow. Wow. I think COVID has given us a glimpse of what the future of the church looks like. And what do I know people are listening to this and they're probably like, what the heck does that mean? Um, COVID really has decentralized our like dependence on buildings and our clustering into small communities in order to like go after God or experience God. I think COVID really taught us that we don't need as much as we think we need in order to make the gospel known and to foster community. That's not to say that physical interaction is not important, because it is. So many of us have been clamoring for more physical interaction. But I do think that COVID helped us realize that we spend way too much on the overhead of ministry when we could be dedicating those funds and that energy to the work of justice and equity and bringing some joy in the process. So the future of the church, I hope, is a more accessible future, because COVID also taught us the same thing that people with disabilities have been saying for years, that the church need not be bound to the building because most of your buildings are not accessible to us anyway. So I hope that in the spirit of that we open up our spaces more, and that we are not as dependent upon our buildings, so that people who will never step foot into a church building can experience the love of God in a way that matters and makes sense to them.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, absolutely, right? Being able to create a Christianity and a church that is more accessible, that doesn't spend so much effort and energy on like creating nice fun programs that don't really go anywhere, but spends more energy on actually creating a sustainable, equitable world.
Yeah. I think for so long we've been buying into this idea erroneously that if we build it, they will come.
Right. Yep.
And COVID upended all of that.
Yeah.
Because we can do all the building we want to do now. I think people realize how comfortable it is for them to go to church on a Sunday morning in their pajamas, on their couch with a cup of coffee and their puppy sitting next to them. I'm projecting a little bit, even as a pastor. But it is, at some point we got to understand that we got to offer people more than what they get on a Sunday morning. Because if I can get that on my couch, what's the point of me coming into the building on a weekly basis? So how, I think the question has to become, how do I empower the people who I am charged to lead? How do I empower them to be the spirit infleshed in the world? How do I make it so that they understand that God is in them and God wants to do something in and through them in the world beyond what they experience on a Sunday morning? I think that's really what we have to wrestle with.
Yes.
And I think that's the question that the church has been wrestling with since its beginning. So we're right back at square one.
Right. We've gone nowhere, but we've gone somewhere at the same time.
Exactly.
Yeah. So last question is, if someone were to come to you and say, hey, JJ, what's one thing that you would say really impacted your life or helped you on your journey, and you could give that to someone else, what would that be?
Whew, man. What is the one thing? So Whitney Houston sang a song, The Greatest Love of All is, she said, the greatest love of all is inside of me, right? Man, I would say that learning to love myself for who I am and who I am becoming has been the greatest gift. And surrounding myself with people who affirm my love for myself has been the greatest gift. And so as you get to know yourself, leaning into that new self, whether it's daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, and finding people who affirm that, that has been the most life-giving for me. So I yeah, in that same vein, I would hope and pray that those who are listening to this have that same experience, that they encounter love for themselves, but that they are also surrounded by people who will affirm their love for themselves, just the way they are, without pretense, without strings attached, all, me being me, that you would be fully embraced in your me-ness, is really what I hope, because that's what's made the difference for me.
Amen. Well, thank you so much, JJ. This was a pleasure.
Thank you for the opportunity. I had a lot of fun. We should do this again.
Absolutely.